Imagine living in a town where the darkness feels thicker, as if it has a will of its own. 5 years ago, Jenny Porter disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but chilling whispers and a haunting silence. The once vibrant town of Greystone, now cloaked in an oppressive gloom, hides a dark secret that refuses to be forgotten. In this unsettling episode, join me as we delve into the harrowing story of Sarah Myers, a young woman whose life was forever altered by her best friend's mysterious vanishing. What she uncovers is far more horrifying than she ever imagined. As Sarah revisits the shadows of her past, she stumbles upon a hidden journal that reveals the terrifying presence of the Hat Man, an ancient, malevolent force that preys on fear. But when she performs a desperate ritual to banish this darkness, she realizes too late that some shadows never truly fade away. Stay with me until the end if you dare to face the unspeakable terror that lurks in the corners of our world. Because once you know what's coming, there's no turning back. Turn off the lights, lock the doors, and prepare yourself for a journey into the depths of fear. You're about to hear a story that will make you question every shadow you see. If you love real horror stories and experiences that will keep you up at night, subscribe to the channel now. Hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a spine-chilling episode. Join us and get ready to face fear, one story at a time. 5 long years have passed since Jenny Porter vanished from the sleepy town of Greystone, but the shadow of that night still hangs over me, a constant reminder of my failure. The once vibrant community, which was filled with the buzz of daily life and laughter, has become a place of hushed whispers and eerie silence. The laughter that once echoed through the streets has been replaced by a heavy, oppressive quiet that never seems to lift. I was Jenny's best friend, and the burden of not being able to save her has been a relentless ache in my heart. That fateful night haunts my dreams with relentless persistence. I remember it as vividly as if it had happened yesterday. Jenny's bed, empty and untouched, the shattered lamp on the floor, its broken glass scattered like tiny stars across the carpet, and the cold, biting air that seemed to seep into every crevice of her room. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I can still see the shadows that danced on the walls, taunting me with their dark, sinister shapes. They seemed to mock my helplessness, their shifting forms a cruel reminder of the terror Jenny must have felt. Each time I close my eyes, I see her face, pale, wide-eyed, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. The sound of her voice, her last desperate plea for help, echoes in my mind, a chilling reminder of my failure to protect her. After high school, I fled Greystone as soon as I could. I thought that leaving behind the town's oppressive atmosphere would help me escape the memories that clung to me like a shroud. I moved to a bustling city, where the noise and activity provided a temporary distraction. But the past has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run. The memories of that night never truly left me. They followed me like a shadow, lurking in the periphery of my consciousness. This summer, the past caught up with me once again. My parents had decided to leave Greystone for good, unable to shake the pervasive sense of unease that had settled over the town since Jenny disappeared. They needed my help to pack up the house, and I couldn't refuse. As I sorted through the remnants of our old life, the memories of that night surged back with a ferocity that left me reeling. It was during one of those long, dusty evenings in the attic that I stumbled upon something that sent a chill down my spine. The attic was a cluttered mess of old furniture, forgotten mementos, and boxes filled with the detritus of our lives. Amidst the jumble of forgotten relics, I found a small, leather-bound journal. My hands shook as I realized whose journal it was. It was Jenny's. And then, the final entry, a heart-stopping message: "They're coming for me tonight. I can feel it. I'm so scared, but maybe if they take me, they'll leave everyone else alone." The words seemed to bleed off the page, echoing with a sense of foreboding that made my skin crawl. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The oppressive cold that had filled Jenny's room that night seemed to seep back into the attic, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The shadows in the corners of the attic seemed to stretch and twist, as though they were alive, and I could feel their eyes on me. I stumbled down the stairs, my mind racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The revelation in Jenny's journal had opened a door I had hoped was forever closed, and I was left with the chilling knowledge that the Hat Man was not just a figment of Jenny's imagination but a real and terrifying presence. That night, sleep was a distant memory. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed to amplify the growing sense of dread within me. The shadows that danced on the walls were no longer just remnants of my imagination. They seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as if they were aware of my fear and feeding off it. The oppressive darkness in the corners of my room felt almost alive, pressing in on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I could almost feel the Hat Man's cold, malevolent gaze, even though I couldn't see him. My mind raced with the unsettling realization that the Hat Man was out there, somewhere. His presence was like a dark cloud hanging just beyond my line of sight, a constant reminder that the nightmare was far from over. Every little sound, the whisper of the wind against the window, the distant hum of traffic, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence of the house. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. It was as if invisible eyes were boring into me, scrutinizing every movement, every breath. Desperate for answers and driven by a mix of fear and hope, I made my way to Old Man Hutchins. His house was a world away from the clean, orderly surroundings of my childhood home. It was isolated, perched on the edge of town, surrounded by a forest of twisted trees and overgrown weeds. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time itself, with its sagging roof and peeling paint giving it an air of long-abandoned mystery. When I knocked on Hutchins' door, the sound echoed through the night, swallowed by the thick, damp air. The door creaked open, revealing Hutchins peering out with eyes that were both weary and wary. As soon as he saw the journal in my trembling hands, his expression shifted from suspicion to grim recognition. Without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for me to enter. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of incense mixed with something else, an almost metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The house was a labyrinth of old books, dusty artifacts, and strange symbols scrawled on the walls. The faint light from a single flickering lamp cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance and move of their own accord. Hutchins led me to a cluttered living room filled with ancient relics and tattered furniture. It was as if the room was frozen in time, holding on to secrets that refused to be forgotten. He gestured for me to sit on a threadbare armchair, its fabric worn thin from years of use. I sank into it, feeling its sagging cushions beneath me as Hutchins settled into a nearby chair. His eyes, sharp and knowing, never left the journal I clutched in my hands. "I warned them," Hutchins said, his voice barely more than a rasp. His gaze was distant, as if he was reliving the past. "Warned the town about the shadows. The Hat Man, he's an ancient thing, older than this town. He feeds on fear, on souls. Jenny," he trailed off, shaking his head with a mournful sigh. "She wasn't the first, and she won't be the last." The cold weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. "Then how do we stop him?" I asked, my voice wavering despite my efforts to remain composed. Hutchins gave me a sad, almost pitying smile. "You don't. The Hat Man can't be killed or banished, not permanently. But you can drive him away for a time, if you're strong enough." He began explaining the ritual, a bizarre amalgamation of old Christian rites and even older pagan practices. The ritual required lighting candles, drawing intricate symbols with salt on the floor, and reciting an incantation in a language I didn't recognize. As Hutchins described each step, his voice grew more somber, as though he was recounting a grim story he had hoped to forget. The ritual sounded like a desperate, last-ditch effort against a force that was beyond human understanding. That night, I prepared for the ritual in my parents' basement. The basement was dimly lit, its low ceiling and dusty corners giving it a foreboding atmosphere that seemed perfect for summoning or repelling dark forces. The walls were lined with old shelves filled with forgotten odds and ends, boxes of old toys, broken appliances, and dusty old books. The air was thick with the musty scent of neglect, a fitting backdrop for the ritual I was about to perform. I began by drawing the symbols on the floor with trembling hands, the salt forming strange, intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer with a faint, eerie light. The symbols looked almost alive, shifting and changing as I worked. I set up the candles in a circle around the symbols, their flickering flames casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The candles filled the basement with a soft, golden light, but it did little to dispel the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. As darkness fell over Greystone, I recited the incantation, my voice quavering but determined. Each word felt like a challenge against the encroaching terror. The shadows in the basement seemed to grow thicker, their forms shifting and swirling as if they were alive. I could feel the Hat Man's presence, a cold, oppressive force at the edge of the light. His tall, thin figure was barely visible, framed by the darkness, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his gaze, a piercing, malevolent force that seemed to dig into my very soul. The shadows surged toward me, their dark tendrils reaching out as if trying to drag me into their depths. But the symbols on the floor flared to life, their lines glowing with an ethereal light that held the shadows at bay. The Hat Man's presence was palpable, a smothering force of cold and malice that seemed to claw at the edges of the protective circle I had drawn. Despite the shimmering barrier, I could feel the shadows pressing against it, as if testing its strength, probing for any weakness. I continued to recite the incantation, my voice steadying with each repetition. The words felt foreign on my tongue, their meanings obscure, but there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness. The shadows writhed and twisted, their shapes distorting grotesquely as if they were trying to escape the confines of the circle. The Hat Man remained just outside the boundary of light, his presence a constant, oppressive weight. His form was a stark silhouette against the darkness, and though I couldn't see his face, I could feel his gaze, a cold, hungry stare that seemed to strip away any semblance of comfort or safety. His stillness was unnerving, as if he was waiting for something, biding his time until the ritual's power waned. As I reached the final words of the incantation, I poured every ounce of my will into them. My voice grew stronger, more forceful, as if I could will the Hat Man away through sheer determination. The symbols on the floor flared brightly, their light intensifying and pushing the shadows back. The oppressive cold in the room seemed to ease slightly, though the Hat Man's presence lingered like a bad dream. Then, with a final, resolute shout, I completed the ritual. The air seemed to still, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting as the symbols glowed one last time before fading. The Hat Man's form wavered, his silhouette becoming increasingly indistinct until he was nothing more than a distant, fading memory. Exhausted and trembling, I collapsed to the floor, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from my system. The basement was silent now, the flickering candle flames casting long shadows that seemed far less menacing. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. The darkness had been pushed back, and the Hat Man had retreated. But as I sat there in the dim light, my relief was tempered by an unsettling sensation. The basement seemed to pulse with a quiet, almost anticipatory energy. It was then that I noticed something strange. The symbols I had drawn on the floor appeared to be shifting, rearranging themselves as if they had a life of their own. The light from the candles flickered erratically, casting distorted, dancing shadows on the walls. A creeping dread washed over me as I realized that something was not right. I leaned closer to examine the symbols, and the shifting patterns gradually formed words in a language I couldn't fully comprehend. The letters seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent life of their own, flickering and writhing as if they were made from the very darkness they represented. The message read, "You can't hide forever. I will return for what was taken. You belong to the shadows now, you belong to me now." The words seemed to etch themselves into my mind, their sinister promise resonating with a chilling finality. The salt line, which had been my only defense, now appeared fragile, as though the Hat Man's influence was already beginning to corrode it from within. A cold dread settled into my bones as I realized the full scope of the message. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. The Hat Man had been driven back, but he was far from defeated. His return was not a matter of if, but when. And next time, he would come for me. As I stared at the symbols, I felt the oppressive presence of the Hat Man lingering just outside the protective circle, watching me with unseen eyes. The basement, once a place of desperate hope, now felt like a trap, a place where I was caught between the light and the encroaching darkness. The shadows seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if they were eager for the next encounter. I knew then that I had not seen the last of the Hat Man. The battle had only just begun, and the shadows would always be lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. I would have to be ready, stronger and more vigilant than ever before, for the darkness would never truly be vanquished. The days following the ritual were a blur of anxiety and restless nights. I tried to convince myself that I had done enough to push the Hat Man back, but deep down, I could feel the shadows lingering, just beyond the edge of my vision. The feeling of being watched never truly left me, and the darkness seemed to cling to my every step, an ever-present reminder that the Hat Man was still out there, waiting. My parents were preoccupied with packing up the house, oblivious to the growing dread that gnawed at me. They were eager to move on, to leave Greystone behind and start fresh in the city. They spoke of new beginnings and new opportunities, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were moving with us, that they would follow us wherever we went. The final days in Greystone were a whirlwind of packing boxes, organizing belongings, and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I couldn't help but notice how the shadows in the house seemed to grow longer and darker with each passing day. The old house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind outside seemed to echo with a sense of impending doom. One night, while I was alone in the basement, sorting through the last of the boxes, I felt a chill that went beyond the usual draft of the old house. The basement, once a haven of frantic activity, now felt oppressive and claustrophobic. The shadows in the corners seemed to move with a life of their own, stretching and writhing as if they were eager to break free. I could feel the presence of the Hat Man, a dark cloud hanging just outside the edge of the dim light. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was no longer alone. The oppressive cold seemed to seep into my bones, making it hard to concentrate. I glanced around the basement, searching for something, anything, to distract myself from the creeping terror. It was then that I noticed a faint scratching sound, coming from the direction of the old furnace. The sound was almost imperceptible, a soft, rhythmic scratching that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. I approached the furnace cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows seemed to coalesce around the furnace, thickening and darkening as I drew nearer. I peered into the dimly lit space, straining to see what was making the noise. The scratching continued, a relentless, unnerving sound that sent shivers down my spine. I could barely make out a shape moving in the darkness, a shadowy figure that seemed to writhe and twist. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking as I fumbled to turn it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the area around the furnace. To my horror, I saw a small, indistinct shape scurrying away into the shadows. It was gone before I could get a clear look, but the sense of unease lingered. The shadow seemed to retreat, as if they were waiting for something, biding their time until I let my guard down. The rest of the night was a sleepless ordeal. Every little noise, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet of the house. I could feel the Hat Man's presence, a cold, malignant force that seemed to press in from all sides. The darkness seemed to cling to me, wrapping around me like a shroud. The following day, I decided to take a break from packing and went for a walk through town. Greystone had a different feel now, quieter, more foreboding. The streets, once bustling with life, now felt deserted, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The old buildings loomed over me, their facades weathered and worn, and the shadows seemed to stretch and elongate in the afternoon sun. I wandered aimlessly, my mind preoccupied with the lingering sense of dread. I passed by Jenny Porter's old house, now abandoned and overgrown with weeds. The place looked like a ghost of its former self, its windows boarded up and its yard choked with neglect. I couldn't help but shiver as I looked at it, the memory of that night still fresh in my mind. As I walked, I found myself drawn to the edge of town, where Old Man Hutchins lived. The house was still as enigmatic as ever, its presence a dark spot on the edge of the forest. I stood outside for a moment, contemplating whether to go in. The last time I had seen Hutchins, he had given me the ritual, but now, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face him again. My internal struggle was interrupted by a sudden, icy gust of wind that made me shiver. I turned to see a shadowy figure standing just outside the edge of the forest, watching me with unseen eyes. The figure was obscured by the darkness, its form shifting and wavering as if it were made of shadows. My heart raced as I realized what I was looking at. It was the Hat Man. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to my parents' house, my footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The sense of terror was overwhelming, a relentless force that seemed to push me forward. As I reached the house, I slammed the door behind me, the sound reverberating through the empty rooms. I locked the door and collapsed against it, trying to catch my breath. The shadows in the house seemed to press in from all sides, their oppressive presence a constant reminder of the Hat Man's return. The message from the basement echoed in my mind, a chilling promise that the darkness was far from over. As I sat in the dim light of the living room, my mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. The Hat Man was back, and this time, he wouldn't be easily dismissed. The shadows had returned, and I knew that I would have to face them once again. The battle was far from over, and the darkness would always be waiting, just beyond the edge of the light. The hours dragged on that night, and sleep felt like a distant memory. The oppressive darkness seemed to press against the walls of the house, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I knew I needed to act quickly, but the fear that gripped me made it difficult to think clearly. The Hat Man was back, and the shadows had grown stronger, more insidious. I could feel their cold fingers brushing against my skin, tugging at my sanity. By dawn, I was a bundle of nerves. The idea of facing the Hat Man again was terrifying, but the reality of what I had seen made it clear that I had no choice. I decided to go back to Old Man Hutchins for help. I needed to understand what the message meant, and if there was any way to protect myself from the Hat Man's wrath. I arrived at Hutchins' house with the first light of day, my breath visible in the chill morning air. The house loomed before me, its dark windows seeming to stare back as if they held secrets of their own. I knocked on the door with a sense of urgency, my knuckles white from the cold. Hutchins answered the door with his usual wary expression, but when he saw the terror in my eyes, his face softened with a mix of pity and concern. Without a word, he led me inside to the cluttered living room. The space was filled with odd trinkets and dusty books, their presence adding to the air of unsettling mystery. We sat at a small table, and I handed Hutchins the journal I had found. He leafed through the pages with a grave expression, his eyes narrowing as he reached the final entry. The room seemed to grow colder as he read, the shadows in the corners of the room darkening in response. "I see you've encountered the Hat Man," Hutchins said, his voice low and somber. "This entity feeds on fear, and it's bound to the shadows. It thrives on the darkness within us, and once it's attached itself, it's difficult to escape." He paused, his gaze distant as if he were recalling something from long ago. "The ritual I gave you, it's not a permanent solution. It can push him back, but he's not easily vanquished. You must be prepared for the possibility that he will return. I felt a shiver run down my spine. What should I do now? How can I protect myself? Hutchins sighed deeply. There's a way to reinforce the protection, but it requires a more powerful ritual. It involves gathering certain items and performing the ritual during the darkest night of the month, when the shadows are at their strongest. He explained that I needed a few rare ingredients: salt from a specific location, an old silver mirror, and a special candle made from a particular type of wax. These items would amplify the protection provided by the ritual. Hutchins gave me a list and instructions, emphasizing the importance of completing the ritual precisely as described. Determined, I set out to gather the necessary items. Each ingredient had its own unique challenge. The salt had to be collected from a specific ancient location rumored to be haunted. The silver mirror was an antique, found in an old shop on the outskirts of town. The wax came from a candle maker who lived in seclusion. The process of gathering these items was grueling. The salt was obtained from a desolate, windswept area that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The mirror was hidden away in a shop filled with eerie, forgotten relics. The candle wax, when obtained, had an unsettling, otherworldly quality that made my skin crawl. With the items in hand, I returned to the house, feeling a sense of dread and anticipation. The night of the ritual was approaching, and I knew that it had to be performed during the darkest hours. I spent the day preparing, setting up the items in the basement where I had performed the previous ritual. As night fell, I lit the special candle and began arranging the symbols on the floor with the salt. The silver mirror was placed in a central position, reflecting the candle's light and casting eerie shadows on the walls. The atmosphere in the basement grew thick with tension as I prepared to perform the ritual. The moment I began the incantation, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive. They writhed and twisted around me, their movements more aggressive than before. The Hat Man's presence was palpable, an oppressive force that pressed in from all sides. The candlelight flickered, casting unsettling patterns on the walls as I chanted the ancient words. The shadows surged toward me, but the symbols on the floor held them back. I could feel the Hat Man's cold gaze upon me, his dark figure looming just beyond the edge of the light. The ritual demanded my full concentration, and I recited the incantation with every ounce of strength I had. The shadows fought back fiercely, their movements chaotic and desperate. The candlelight seemed to wane, and I struggled to keep the symbols intact. My voice grew hoarse, but I pushed through, determined to finish the ritual. The pressure of the darkness was overwhelming, but I could feel the protective barrier holding strong. Finally, with a final, forceful shout, I completed the ritual. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissipating into the corners of the room. The Hat Man's presence seemed to waver, and for a brief moment, I glimpsed a face beneath the hat, hollow, gaunt, and filled with ancient hunger. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, the oppressive darkness lifting from the room. I collapsed to the floor, trembling with exhaustion and relief. The basement was quiet now, the shadows retreating to their dark corners. I knew the Hat Man had been driven back, but the sense of dread lingered. I understood that this battle was far from over, and that the darkness would always be waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. The silence in the basement was almost deafening after the ritual. I could barely hear the hum of the old furnace, its comforting noise now a mere whisper compared to the chaos that had just unfolded. I sat there, hunched over, my breathing ragged and uneven. The candle's flicker was the only source of light, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, I felt a strange calm, as if the very act of completing the ritual had somehow severed the link between me and the Hat Man. But as I gathered my strength to stand, a creeping unease settled over me. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though the darkness was somehow aware of the ritual's conclusion. I slowly got to my feet, my legs feeling like lead. My hands shook as I glanced around the basement, trying to reassure myself that it was over. But something felt wrong, an unsettling presence that I couldn't quite place. The symbols I had drawn in salt seemed to shimmer strangely, their once clear lines now appearing to writhe and shift under the candlelight. As I examined the symbols more closely, I noticed something disturbing. The intricate patterns I had drawn were subtly altering themselves, the salt forming new shapes and patterns that defied logic. My heart raced as I realized that the barrier I had worked so hard to create was beginning to dissolve. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to check the other symbols, but it was too late. In the dim light, I saw it, a message, written in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The letters seemed to be made of shadow, shifting and changing as if alive. The message was clear, its meaning seeping into my mind like a dark whisper. You can't hide forever. I will return for what was taken. You belong to the shadows now, you belong to me now. The words echoed in my head, each one like a cold, cruel taunt. I felt a chill creep up my spine as the realization dawned on me. The Hat Man wasn't defeated. He had simply been driven away for a time. The promise in those words was unmistakable. He would return, and next time, he would come for me. I backed away from the symbols, my eyes darting around the basement, searching for any sign of the Hat Man's presence. The shadow seemed to stretch and curl, reaching out toward me as if in anticipation. My breath quickened, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. The oppressive darkness that had once been so palpable was now even more intense, pressing in on me from all sides. Desperation drove me to try and reinforce the symbols, but my hands were unsteady, and the salt seemed to slip through my fingers like grains of sand. The candle's light flickered wildly, casting eerie, disorienting patterns on the walls. I felt as though I was caught in a nightmarish dance with the shadows, each movement only drawing me further into their grasp. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, a sudden, overwhelming cold swept through the basement. It was as if the very air had turned to ice, and I could feel the Hat Man's presence lingering just beyond the edge of the light. The shadows seemed to pulsate with a dark rhythm, and the sense of being watched was almost suffocating. In a final, desperate attempt to regain control, I grabbed the journal and held it close, hoping that the words within might offer some solace or guidance. But as I skimmed through the pages, the comforting familiarity of Jenny's handwriting only served to deepen my dread. The entries about the Hat Man, the shadows, and the growing sense of fear now seemed to be coming true in the most horrifying way. The night dragged on, and as dawn approached, I was left alone in the basement with my thoughts and fears. The Hat Man's message had left me shaken, and the knowledge that he would return made it difficult to think of anything else. I knew I couldn't stay in Greystone much longer. The town had become a place of nightmares, and I was trapped in its dark embrace. As the first light of morning crept into the basement, I finally allowed myself to breathe, if only for a moment. The Hat Man had been driven back, but his promise was a chilling reminder that the darkness was never far away. I had to leave, to escape the shadows that seemed to follow me, but deep down, I knew that running wouldn't be enough. The Hat Man would come for me again, and next time, I wouldn't be so fortunate. I had to be ready, to face the darkness with whatever strength I had left. The shadows were always lurking, waiting for their chance to reclaim what was theirs. And so, with a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, I prepared to leave Greystone. The town's eerie silence followed me as I packed up the last of my belongings. I knew that no matter where I went, the Hat Man's promise would remain with me. I couldn't escape the shadows, but I had to try, if only to buy myself a little more time before the darkness claimed me for good.